fiscal challenges in our country, but we cannot put a price on human life. And nothing is more important than keeping our communities, our families, and our economy safe. With that, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent that we be dispensed with a quorum call,
Without objection.
that I may be recognized to speak.
Under the previous order, the question occurs on amendment number 651, offered by the senator from Florida, Mr. Rubio, and there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to the vote.
Thank you, Madam President, and I'll be brief. The amendment's pretty simple and straightforward. It just returns the TAA program back to its original intent. It was designed to help workers that were displaced from their jobs or lost their jobs as a result of trade practices, and primarily as a result of free trade agreements between the United States and other countries. It's one of the reasons why I believe the majority has brought this issue before us before proceeding to the free trade agreements with South Korea, with Panama, with Colombia. And what this does is it returns it back to that, clearly recognizing that there are workers that have been hurt by unfair trade practices, unrelated to trade agreements, whether it's what China does or other nations do, and those things need to be dealt with. But they need to be dealt with separately. This program was originally designed to help workers who were harmed in the short term by, and that's why it's called adjustment, by workers who were trying to adjust as a result of some disruptions that may have occurred as a result of a trade agreement. I think what we can take solace in knowing is that the best thing you can do for a worker who has lost their job is get them a job, and ultimately that's what free trade agreements do. They create jobs in America, as the White House has recognized, and so my hope is that we will proceed quickly to passage of the 3 free trade agreements, and again I urge the White House to submit those and for this body to take them up as soon as possible. With that, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you very much. The conflict here with regard to the amendment that's been proposed is that on our side of this debate, we think that this should be a broad array of help for workers. If a worker loses his or her job and we can provide eligibility for trade adjustment assistance, we shouldn't limit that just to the 17 countries with which we have a trade agreement. Say if we have a problem with massive job loss as a result of what China's doing, either because they're cheating on currency or not playing by the rules, as we know they have not in many instances. I have a chart here, a table that indicates in fiscal year 2012, when you look at the estimated number of workers certified under trade adjustment, whether they're import-related certifications or whether they're all other certifications, you added up 287,000, more than 287,000 people that are impacted, and a lot of those are impacted by way of unfair trade from China.
Fired.
I yield the floor. Yes.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inoue. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Cornyn, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, and Rubio. Senators voting in the negative: Akaka, Casey, Grassley, Hagan, Nelson of Nebraska, and Reed of Nevada. Mr. Kirk. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg, no. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Vitter, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Lugar, aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, no. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn, aye. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman, no. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Brown of Ohio, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Dement. Mr. Dement, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, no. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, no. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Nelson of Florida, no. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, no. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, no. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, no. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Inouye, no. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow, no. Mr. Pryor, no. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey, no. Mr. Webb. Mr. Webb, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, no. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, no. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Kyle, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, no. Mrs. Hutchison, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Baucus. Mr. Baucus? No. Mr. Conrad? Mr. Conrad? No. Mrs. Feinstein? Mrs. Feinstein? No. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall of Colorado? No. Mr. Portman? No. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow? No.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change their vote? On this vote, the yeas are 34, the nays are 62. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to. Under the previous order, the question occurs on amendment number 650, offered by the senator from South Dakota, Mr. Thune, and there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to the vote.
No, man. Madam President.
Senators, may we have order? The senator from South Dakota.
Madam President, my amendment simply requires a study by the International Trade Commission when a trade agreement has been signed but the implementing legislation has not been taken up by Congress within 2 years. The study will examine the impact of lost export opportunities, the impact on U.S. jobs, and the impact on the protection of U.S. intellectual property resulting from the delay. Today we've got anecdotal evidence, but there isn't any comprehensive government report on what delay means for U.S. businesses and our economy. I wish this amendment weren't necessary, but we've seen with Korea, with Colombia, and with Panama agreements, we cannot assume.
Senators, please take your conversations outside.
We cannot assume that an agreement is going to be implemented swiftly after it's been signed. Now, this amendment isn't about casting blame. The study will apply to trade agreements, whether negotiated by a Democrat or a Republican president. It's not about the past. It's just the fact, Madam President, that Congress deserves better information about the impact when we delay these trade agreements. And this doesn't affect TAA. It doesn't affect the underlying bill. It doesn't affect passage in the House. It's a common-sense amendment, and I hope my colleagues will support it.
President.
Senator from Oregon.
President, I rise in opposition to this amendment. Our exporters are facing major challenges.
Please.
Our exporters face major challenges in global markets. We're faced with surging imports from China. China has a regime in place that is cheating American innovators and forcing them to share their intellectual property. Instead of dedicating the scarce resources of the International Trade Commission to look into these issues and identify other foreign trade barriers that impede our exporters, we would essentially task the International Trade Commission to tell us what we already know. For example, we know that in the case of the pending agreements, we had an opportunity to get a better deal for our companies that export automobiles and to promote human rights in Colombia by reducing violence. We're on the precipice of considering these agreements. Let's not turn back the clock. Instead of using scarce resources to have an armchair debate about what we already know, let's dedicate the resources to this agency to help workers and business. I yield the floor.
Has expired.
Mr. President, I ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? Appears there is. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander.
Right here, man.
Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. DeMint. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken.
No.
Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu,
Yes.
Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown of Massachusetts, Burr, Coates, Cochran, Collins, Cornyn, Crapo, DeMint, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Hutchison, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Lee, Lieberman, Lugar, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Sessions, Shelby, Snow, Thune, Toomey, Bitter, Wicker. Mr. McCain, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Akaka, Baucus, Begich, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Conrad, Coons, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Inouye, Johnson of South Dakota, Kerry, Cole, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Rockefeller, Sanders, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Webb, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Coburn, aye. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Casey, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Kyle, aye. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no.
Of course I do, that's right. Are there any senators wishing to vote or change his or her vote? There being none, on this vote, the yeas are 44, the nays are 52. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to. There are now 10 minutes of debate prior to a vote in relation to amendment number 634, offered by the senator from Texas,